of the interwar periods of Europe, the West, and the nationalism in all the countries, and the political, economical state of every country.
And a big part of pretty much of what everything was happening with each country in the interwar periods, what happened, the political and economical factors of each and every individual country that was involved. And the other things we have to bring up in this documentary are the Spanish Civil War, the Roaring Twenties, the Dirty Thirties, communism versus fascism, and one of the big parts in the mid-interwar was the League of Nations, and that's World War I and World War II. There's a lot that happened in the middle, but you can't really just start into something that's kind of already started. So oftentimes people look for someone or something to blame. And me and my buddies here, we would much like to blame France. I know a lot of other people would. You could say it was Serbia, you could say it was Austria, you could say it was Italy for all anyone cares. Sitting around and, picking the winning side, right? But really, just for now, we're blaming it on France. So at the time, who was France? I mean, they pretty much punished Hitler so bad, not Hitler, but Germany creating Hitler in the future with the Treaty of Versailles. But at the time, who was France? Mainly two leaders, two people, men. So first off, we have Poincaré. Poincaré wasn't really too major, but he did order the occupation of the Ruhr and wanted to order the occupation of the Rhineland, but quite didn't get that. So they kind of just stuck with the Ruhr. The second guy I'm going to be talking about is Clément, however you pronounce it. This guy in the League of Nations after World War I wanted to lay the hammer on Germany. Why? Probably because France got the worst out of anyone. I mean, France was arguably the closest to Germany, aside from Italy and Austria, and maybe, all the other countries down to the east. But that's not really fair, because those countries were aligned with Austria at the time and Germany. So this guy pretty much took the brunt of every single blow that Germany had to offer. If you want to talk about who really got the worst end of the stick when it comes to being blamed for things, we're going to talk about the Weimar Republic. So Germany, we're just going to call it Germany. Germany got blamed for obviously everything in World War I and was in millions to trillions to billions, whatever numbers they owed to France. Lots of money to France. Why? Because of the craters in farmers' fields, the cities, the gas that was probably still in the land after the wars were done in World War I, Vimy Ridge, the trenches, all of that irreversible damage that probably will take centuries to just even repair. Now, there was something called the Treaties of Versailles that soon shaped one man who actually fought in the World War I, and why they have to, really step things up is because after World War I, the damages, the debt, Germany was pretty much forced to sign this treaty, right? They had no other option. I mean, it was their fault, right? But there was one man in particular that I'm going to talk about that rose to power, because this said man also fought in World War I, and his name was Adolf Hitler. So Adolf Hitler, his backstory mainly to this man is that he was an artist in art school and did flunk out. Not really flunked, more like didn't get accepted. So he took on politics, and in fact, Adolf Hitler did actually fight in World War I. And the reason why gas specifically wasn't used again, well, not as much as it was in World War I, is because him himself remembers how bad it was. I mean, that's not counting the gas chambers. That's just, I'm talking about war. Now, he went into politics after the World War I, after failing art school, all of it, pretty much into a country that was soon to be a third world country if nothing was done. I mean, you're coming into a country that has millions to pay to France. However, Germany wasn't doing too bad, because there was almost like a triangle of money that the USA, the France, and the Germans had kind of like a triangle, because the Germans owed money to the French, and the French somehow owed money to the Americans, and it's not possible for Germany to pay all that money back to France, especially after a war. Hyperinflation, food, the repairs of the war, there's just no way they couldn't afford it. The territory, all of it. So they ended up taking a loan from the United States. So it went States to Germany, Germany to France, and it was just a triangle circle. So everyone was kind of even. That was called the DOS plan. As I said, Hitler rose to power a little bit before 1933, before he became chancellor. So before that, he had held a protest called the Beer Hall Putsch. And this was mainly more of like a protest. And after that protest, which had not gone his way, obviously, he got arrested. And while Hitler was in jail, he wrote a book called Mein Kampf, which means my problem. And this is also another key factor of why Hitler himself got recognition. So Hitler pretty much came into politics knowing and watching his own country fall. He promised to the German people that Germany would make
hyperinflation,
debt, hunger,
and the other stuff that we shouldn't have
taxes,
to bring up.
and yeah.
And the stuff we don't talk about.
The revival. Germany's revival, upbringing. Like Americans would say, make America great again. Hitler promised to his people that he'd make Germany great again. Now, let's just talk about the nationalism aspect. So the nationalism was after the World War I, so weakened that Hitler rose to power, especially from that Mein Kampf book, and became chancellor in 1933. And like I said, promised he would make it great again. This wouldn't have really happened if Germany at the time wasn't so desperate. And even like we said in class, when people have a desperate problem, they look for answers. Answers that may not be, quite as reasonable as having a political leader like Hitler, but he was the answer to a desperate problem. Let's be honest. The next man I want to talk about is Joseph Goebbels. He wasn't actually German, fun fact, but he still was a big part in Germany and Hitler's Reich. So he was the minister of propaganda for Hitler's Reich and the main propagandist for the Nazi Party in general. He was actually a genius. Despite his irrational views and his crazy depictions of the ethnic group of Jews, he was a genius propagandist, because in the end it did work, with all the Nazis having their crazy out of far-right views. And actually, believe it or not, his topics for propaganda included just not only anti-Semitism, but attacks on the Christian churches, and promoted something called positive Christianity. So in the Bible and in the religion, a lot of Christianity actually has a lot to do with Judaism. And the Nazis believed that if they took the Judaism out of Christianity, that it'd be a positive Christianity, just pretty much meaning it'd be a better religion if the Jewish aspect wasn't in it. And so therefore they made also propaganda to and about the Christian churches, which I don't really know how that worked out for them, because in the end there wasn't really any talk of that. I mean, you've got to do some deep digging to find something about the Nazis criticizing Christianity, because most people think that the Nazis just were Christian. In fact, I had no idea that they were making propaganda. This guy was making propaganda, trying to make a religion better than it already is by taking stuff out of it. I mean, that sounds weird, right? And really, I just don't know how that worked out for him. Next one I want to talk about is Japan. So there's actually not too much to be said about Japan, although there is a little bit of key details we can cherry pick about Japan. I mean, all information is cherry picked, of course. But, dude, stop.
Stop,
bro.
Matthew, do you need to go take a walk?
Do you need to leave, dude?
Yes. Then go.
Leave,
go,
bro.
Matthew.
Just leave.
Then go.
What's so funny about cherry picking?
I'll walk you out, Matthew. Come
Sorry,
on.
I immediately thought you were referring to fucking the Nazis again.
How to talk about Japan at some point. So Japan, there's not much to be said about Japan, other than the massive amount of war crimes they committed and the invasion of Manchuria. Now Japan actually today isn't taught about the horrible things that they've done. See, in places like Germany with the Nazi Party, they teach kids in school about it so that nothing like that will ever happen again. They don't teach Japan about the kind of horrendous things they've done. But first we're going to talk about the invasion of Manchuria. So the emperor at this time's name was Emperor Hiroto. And Emperor Hiroto actually didn't order the invasion on Manchuria. The Japan army kind of did that themselves. The Japanese army didn't do that through the order of Emperor Hiroto. But he didn't dispose of the idea. He actually really didn't know about it until it was over. So after that war had happened, after that invasion had happened, Emperor Hiroto was like, no, I'm not against it. And it didn't hurt anybody, and it was successful. So he kind of just went with it. Now, Emperor Hiroto here actually had a general in all of his armies. His name was General Shigeru Hanju. This guy is pretty fly for an Asian guy, let's just say. Now, he was the commander-in-chief of the Kwantung Army, a big part in the invasion of Manchuria, one of the bigger armies and fleets. So, while we get into that, he kind of had some war crimes going on for him. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing to be said at all. He's fly, but that's not cool. Now, these war crimes include making biological weapons, such as the bubonic plague, Black Plague, anthrax, and many other ones to use against people that they were invading or in war with, which, like the Nazi Party, it's sickening. So, I'll give you a little did you know, Mr. Beestrom. Did you know that this guy had something called Unit 731? Maybe not him, maybe not Emperor Hiroto, but it was something the Japanese did. Now, Unit 731 was pretty much forceful surgeries on patients who were very much awake and very much still alive, offering pregnancies, surgeries without anesthesia, pretty disgusting things. While they were awake, fully functional, nerves not numbed, anything. If you think the dentist is bad, yikes. Imagine having a hip replaced.
All right. The Soviet Union, which is now modern-day Russia, minus a few other countries, is a European and Asian country that had to drop out of World War I about halfway through. Now, why did it do that? Well, there was a revolution happening in Russia at this time, spearheaded by the Bolsheviks. Now, the Bolsheviks were led by a man named Vladimir Lenin. Now, Vladimir Lenin was a very charismatic person, a very good talker, an amazing talker. Now, he had an ideology called communism or Marxism. So you see, Marxism was an ideology written by a man named Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote a book called the Communist Manifesto. And Lenin read this book, and he enjoyed it quite a bit. So much, in fact, that he wanted to make his country of Russia a communist nation. But now how he did that was through a pretty violent means. As most communist revolutions happen, they're pretty violent. So Lenin took his joy in killing the opposition and manipulating people into believing in his ideology. Basically what he said is if you don't convert to Marxism or communism, you as the worker will be royally screwed over for the rest of your days. And every generation after you will also be screwed for the rest of their days as a worker. Now also, eventually he did come into power and he became the leader of Russia. And now he was the leader of the Communist Party of Russia. And now there's a second guy, a man named Joseph Stalin. Lenin wasn't really a big fan of Joseph Stalin. They were civil, they got along if they were in a room together. But Lenin thought that Stalin was not a very good person to lead the party. He was a power-hungry person who wanted to be basically the antithesis of communism. Because the idea of communism originally was no power, no classes. But Stalin was a big fan of classes. He wanted to be at the tippity top of those classes and control the country. He wanted to control every aspect of this country. The crops, the workers, the military. And Lenin didn't like this guy for that. Not at all. But the thing is that once Lenin had died, Stalin did come into power. One more thing is, how did all these events affect Russian nationalism? Now, Russian nationalism was based on one thing, the collective. Because communism, its basis is the collective, the collective people, the community. And since the communist revolution was successful, there was some kind of nationalism in the collective. They were together as the workers. They were a union of people, hence the name Soviet Union. They were a union of all the Soviets. In the United States after World War I. Some would say they got a pretty good end of the stick since they were pretty isolationist. They were led by a man named Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson wrote something called the 14 Points. And these points were his goal after World War I for what the world should be. A peaceful world with no more war, and a global association of countries, which later became the League of Nations. But all the countries at the Treaty of Versailles decided that the 14 points were not as important. So they created their own League of Nations, which aimed to punish Germany fully for the war, making Germany pay most of the money for the war and a whole lot of reparations to France and other countries. And then after that, they had a president named FDR. FDR was a pretty important president. He pulled the American people out of the Great Depression with the New Deal. The New Deal had 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief was to help the unemployed people during the Great Depression. The recovery was to fix the economy that was tanking very, very badly. And reform was to create new things like the SEC. Now, some other aspects of the New Deal were lasting infrastructure and the abolishment of more laissez-faire practices. And then later in his career, FDR created the second New Deal, which created something called Social Security. Then also, FDR is mostly known as the World War II president, as he helped America through World War II and actually served 3 terms of presidency. There's a fun fact. The British have used the Union Jack flag for the past 225 years. Now, during World War II and a little bit after, they were ran by a prime minister named David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George is a pretty important guy. He was credited quite a bit for his handling of World War I and for his advancements in workers' rights for the country. Now, he was also credited for the League of Nations. He was a pretty big player in that document, in the document of the Treaty of Versailles and the punishment. He didn't want to punish Germany as much as France did, but he did want to give them the hammer a little bit because they didn't do good things to him. Now, second off, after him was a guy named Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the president after David Lloyd George. And what Neville Chamberlain was known for is he was known as the Great Reformer. And he was also known for his work as a Minister of Health. But also, I think mostly what he's known for, he's the guy who appeased Hitler. He's the guy who went to Germany, and he shook Hitler's hand, and he said there would be no World War II. Now, immediately after that, after World War II started, he was known as the guy who brought Britain into World War II, so it didn't go very well, obviously. Now, how did all of this affect British nationalism? So during this time, there was Ireland's independence as well, which was affecting the British identity, because they were the British Empire, of course. But anyway, all this stuff affected British nationalism. Well, Ireland's independence was also happening at this time, and that really did affect the identity and the strength that they thought they had. But also, there was these far right groups emerging at this time. You know, they were emerging from the independence and from the British side, and they were rising up and creating this split between the left and the right, kind of like what's happening today in Britain right now. And this affects the British identity quite a bit, because
Italy during the interwar period was in an unstable place because of the rise of fascism, because of one man, this man, Mussolini. Mussolini was the creator of the fascist party, the first fascist party, in 1919. Leveraging social unrest, nationalism, and violence against socialists. To gain support, he became prime minister following the March on Rome in 1922. He also abolished opposition's parties, restricted freedom of speech, made a secret police, and basically declared himself king in 1929. Emmanuel III was the king of Italy during the entirety of the interwar period, and he aided Mussolini into getting into power, meaning he also aided the rise of fascism. In 1922, Victor refused to declare martial law during the March on Rome, allowing Mussolini to make a government and basically handing over the power to Mussolini. He also allowed Mussolini to invade Abyssinia. In the interwar period, Italian nationalism was pretty high because of them taking over Abyssinia, increasing their prestige.
Now, the League of Nations. That's what we're going to be talking about, and why did it fail? So, first things first, we're going to talk about the structural weaknesses. Decision-making required unanimous votes, which it made it difficult to act quickly or decisively in case of crisis or problems. The second major point that I have for why the League of Nations might have failed was the lack of military force. Every country kind of had their own thing when it came to the military, but not quite like the League of Nations. In fact, theirs was significantly a lot worse than just one country itself, even like Germany at the time. The League had no army and relied on many states, many member states, and many, many nations in the League often just joined so they had that sense of neutrality. But they often relied on member states who were often unwilling to contribute forces or face economic risks. So, I think there's just one more that kind of fits the block. The absent in major powers. So as you guys know, in the League of Nations, who was not created by Woodrow Wilson, maybe it was created, but not created by Woodrow Wilson. But the main thing is if you look on the League of Nations map where all the countries are blue, which indicates which one is and isn't in the League of Nations, they will oftentimes be gray. You notice big parts like the USSR, Russia, America, and in fact Germany missing out of all of these League of Nations, which you'd think they would be. Germany especially after being pummeled from the debt they owed to France, and USA because Woodrow Wilson was a big part in creating the League of Nations, even though it wasn't really his thing. So the United States never actually joined the League. Germany, Japan, and Italy left during the 1930s, severely weakening its influence in that power aspect. I mean, which is really ironic because in World War II, after all, it was Germany, Italy, and Japan, but not the United States, which kind of makes you wonder. So the next thing I'm going to talk about here is the difference and the different key factors about fascism versus communism. And the first one we're going to go over here between Hitler and Stalin is Stalin. So communism. What is the real definition of communism? I have some sticky notes here for my key points. Let's go over the definition first. So communism is a society is stateless, classes and governed directly by the people. This, however, has not been achieved in practice. They've been totalitarian in the nature with a central party governing society. So pretty much the best definition of Stalin. And so the next one we're going to talk about is its political factors and its economic factors. Maybe not economic, but more private property, more where you're allowed to be and where you're not allowed to be. So for communism, private property. So ultimately with Stalin and Russia, maybe in the 1920s, 30s, actually probably to this day, if you're on such private property like that, the definition straight up just says abolished. The concept of property is negative and replaced with the concept of commons and ownership with the usership, which to me sounds just a lot like, hey, there's a difference between using the land and owning the land. You own the land and you're on it, fine. You're not, get out. Now the political factors, last least. International theory or system of social organization based on a holding of all property in common. With that, ownership ascribed to the community or state, rejection of free markets and extreme distrust of capitalism in any form. So very much different from fascism, and my next point here will be fascism. Pretty much reject any and all capitalism for the communists. Now the first definition for fascism. Hitler over here with his beer and vodka, if you cannot tell. So for my first definition of fascism, we're going to go a little bit backwards and we're going to go over the political aspects first. Fascism. One charismatic leader such as Hitler himself has an absolute authority, often the symbol of the state. He could be the head of the state, but not him being the symbol of the state. What I mean here is that even if you looked at Italy and you see in how they had sculpted Mussolini's face all over them big buildings, I don't think they necessarily did that with Hitler, because they had the eagle and or the swastika. Advisors to government are generally picked by merit rather than election, which is a little bit hard to think about because when Hitler was arrested after the Bureau Hall Putsch and wrote Mein Kampf, he actually was voted in by the people. This wasn't a one-sided, one-scale thing. He was voted in by the German people. Now, if we're going to go next from the private property and trespassing. For fascism, normally permitted, continuing open for service, contingent upon service, obedience of usefulness to the state. Now the last one, the actual definition of fascism. An extremely nationalist authoritarian state is usually led by one person at the head of one party. No democratic election of representatives, no free market, no individualism or no individual glory, which kind of makes sense, kind of doesn't, because Hitler kind of did have that individual glory. We know Stalin did, but maybe not as much as Stalin. Two very different things, don't get them mixed up. The state controls the press and all the other media. Like some countries we know today about controlling all of their country's media, all of their country's, alibi. Lots of countries do it, and it is sometimes just straight up propaganda.
The 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties, they're a very important time in history for technological advancements. It gave birth to things like flapper culture, the automobile, and this really huge sense of optimism for the future. So why were they so optimistic? They were optimistic because of many things. They had these advancements such as the automobile, and they had musical advancements such as the blues and jazz, and the invention of somewhat quality recording on shellac records. And also, this gave birth to some freedom for women through flapper culture, where they had much shorter dresses and other things. As the government had voted to ban alcohol in the United States. But the thing is, people did not really care. They started opening illegal bars called speakeasies. And not only that, they started making homemade liquor and rum running. Now what rum running was, is that what they do is they take a vehicle like this, and they stuff rum in the back right there, and they take it down the mountain to sell at the speakeasy. This affects nationalism in a unique way, because this nationalism was based on two things: optimism and freedom. The freedom is because this is still in the time of laissez-faire capitalism, where it was a live and let live thing. You had your business, I had my business, like that. And optimism because of the advancements, like again the automobile, jazz, blues. There was also rolling ashtrays on trains.
The Dirty 30s were a time in the U.S. following the Roaring 20s, where the economy crashes and farmers lose most of their land due to a run of mass droughts and poor farmers' knowledge. You could say that Americans' nationalism was at an all-time low during the Dirty 30s because of these droughts. During the Dirty 30s, Prohibition was also ended, which could have contributed to the nationalism benefiting it.
The Spanish Civil War, a war between the Republicans and the Nationalists. This war was based on political disagreements on wealth, land, and religion. The Nazis backed this war. They backed the Nationalists, by the way, and they used it to test out their new method called Blitzkrieg. But eventually, after a long war, the fascist nationalists won the war due to the Nazi support, and Franco, the nationalist leader, became dictator of Spain until 1975.
Thank you for watching, and that's all we have for today's presentation. That's all the time we had. Hope you enjoyed, Mr. Beestrom. Please give us a good mark.
Mr. Beestrom.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bishop.
Wasn't necessary.
Mr. Bishop.